Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to today's RBS online event titled Teaching with Manuscripts, Material, Digital, and Collaborative Pedagogies. This panel is sponsored by the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography at Rare Book School. My name is Hwee-sang Cho. I'm an assistant professor in Korean Studies at Emory University, and I'll be moderating today's event. This panel is comprised of 4 scholars working on medieval, early modern, 18th century European and Islamic manuscripts. Focusing on hands-on, digital, and collaborative approaches, their papers will address issues related to teaching manuscript studies in graduate and undergraduate literature and art history courses, including paleography, codicology, editing, computational methods, and the physical analysis of manuscript. I think the subject of this panel is very timely and much needed, especially considering the disruption in higher education during the global pandemic. I hope today's discussion will enrich the pedagogical perspectives that all teachers of material text strive to expand in their classrooms, as well as for remote instruction under COVID-19. Now, let me briefly explain how the panel presentations will work today. So all 4 papers will be presented back to back in the order of Sonya Dreamer, Rachel Scarborough-King, Marissa Nicosia, and Yael Rice. To maximize the time for Q&A and discussion after all presentations, I will skip the introduction now, and each panelist will introduce themselves briefly at the beginning of their presentations. And a couple of notes about logistics. If you have any questions for individual presenters or the panel as a whole, please put your questions in the chat box. I will monitor and gather all questions and venture replies or paraphrase them during the Q&A session. Before we begin this exciting panel, I'd like to re-emphasize that this event complies with Rare Book School's Code of Conduct. In this regard, we ask that you refrain from all forms of harassment and offensive conduct. Listen as much as you speak. Remember that colleagues may have expertise of which you are unaware. Accept critique graciously and offer it constructively. Give credit where it is due and stay alert to the comfort, safety, and welfare of all participants to this event. Please also note that today's event is being recorded and will be made available on the RBS YouTube channel later. Without further ado, now I will turn virtual mic over to our first presenter today, Sonya Dreamer.
Thank you very much for that, Hwee-sang. And before I continue speaking, because I can only do one thing at a time, let me start sharing my screen. So just a moment. Excellent, there we are. Well, I am so glad that so many people have shown up. It is a way of forming community at a time that has been enormously challenging. So thank you all for being here. And many thanks to my co-presenters and to Hwee-sang, and especially to Marissa for really being the motivating force behind today's panel. So I am just going to get rolling after I introduce myself really briefly, because I know that our time is limited. And I'll just say that my name is Sonya Drimmer. I teach medieval art in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So my talk today is called Virtual Material: How to Make a Manuscripts Teaching Kit for Remote Instruction. Now, medieval manuscripts bear the traces of bodies, both human and feline, that have traversed their pages for centuries. And you can see a cat paw print on this manuscript of Gower's Confessio Amantis in the Society of Antiquaries in London, and that's right here, which was one of my favorite manuscript finds, I think possibly ever. So the inability to share this aspect of manuscripts with my students was one of the collection of pedagogical disappointments of this pandemic. This spring, I was scheduled to teach my graduate seminar in medieval manuscripts, which I usually teach in our special collections called SKUA in the Du Bois Library at UMass Amherst. And it's a course that combines teaching the concrete skills of codicology and paleography in European manuscripts with the various methods of art historical analysis into books, with readings and theory to inform the questions that students ask and how they might use these skills to address those questions. Now, knowing that I would be teaching this course remotely over Zoom, I decided to entirely revise the course to centralize questions about mediation of books by having it revolve around a famous manuscript of Hildegard von Bingen's visionary treatise Scivias. And the reason why is because the manuscript, which is believed to have been produced under the supervision of Hildegard herself before her death in 1179, has not been seen since 1945. It was put away in Dresden for safekeeping, and then after World War II, when people tried to retrieve it, it was nowhere to be found. All that survives of this manuscript are numerous photographic prints that were taken of it in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I'm showing you this sort of palimpsest over here. A hand-produced parchment facsimile of the manuscript that was produced between 1927 and 1933 by the nuns of Eibingen Abbey, along with the 2012 printed facsimile of that facsimile, and then 10 other manuscript copies of the same text that were made in the Middle Ages survive. So as I was putting together the syllabus for the course, it became clear that the fascinating theoretical issues raised by what has effectively been a virtual medieval manuscript since 1945 really couldn't be approached by my students unless they had a foundational knowledge of paleography and codicology that I would normally be teaching them if we were operating in person. So, to compensate for this lack, to rise to this challenge, I decided to assemble teaching kits for this course, which I plan to send in the mail to my students right before the start of the semester. So you're looking at a photo of all these objects that go into each teaching kit. They're on the floor of my office. Now, for the duration of this talk, I'm going to walk you through the contents of those kits and lay out the pragmatics of assembling and preparing them. But before I do, I need to acknowledge 4 material preconditions that allowed me to do this. Number 1 was a small class size capped at 10 students, and which now it enrolls 8, so not quite full. Number 2 is availability of up to $500 from my university for a teaching grant. So I'm in a secure position at a university that allows us to apply for these funds and grants them rather freely. So, you know, I wasn't out of pocket entirely for this. I also needed access to a printer. I have one at home. And then really importantly, one needs time. We had an extended winter break this year, and I have no children, I have no caretaker responsibilities. So I was able to do all of this with these 4 privileged conditions as preconditions, I should say. So with these preconditions in mind, I put together 8 kits, each of which has the following contents, and I'm itemizing them for you. So I'll just walk you through them now. It included a quill that I got from dennisrude.com, which is a great website for quills, ink from a craft store, practice scripts for tracing Proto-Gothic. That is the text that we'd be working with for the majority of the semester. We'd be doing paleography of this particular script. So I printed out this from another manuscript, from a digitized manuscript. Tracing paper so that my students could trace that script with their quills. Blotting rag, which is just for blotting their quills. I cut up an old t-shirt. Cotton t-shirts work great for that. A wax tablet, which I bought from scribleworkshop.com. Each one of them comes with a stylus. A paper mock-up of an animal skin, courtesy of Lisa Fagan Davis, that design. I just printed it out on paper. I'll tell you what it was for later. Quires for teaching collation. Parchment scraps, which were gifted to me by my colleague, Steve Harris. He had a bunch of parchment scraps and just left them in my pigeonhole one day. So I got that for free. And then sandpaper for preparing the parchment for writing on. In total, each kit was about $60. Now, putting together the quires for collation turned out to be the only truly challenging part of this activity, but arguably the most important for me and most rewarding, hopefully, for my students, since I see collation as one of the foundational skills of approaching a manuscript and learning codicology, at least in the context that I teach it, of medieval European manuscripts. So I'm going to walk you through that part now. In order to put together these choirs, I went online to fully digitize manuscripts that allow me to download JPEGs. That's really, really important. So the New Haven, the Beinecke in New Haven and the Philly Free Library have really easily downloadable JPEGs, so I used manuscripts from those. I selected 2 sequential choirs from each manuscript. The Beinecke comes from the period we're addressing in the class, 12th to early 13th century, and it comprises really standard choirs of 8. So that was their first. That was going to be like my students' training wheels. And then the one from the Free Library of Philly has more complicated choir structures and what I refer to as codicological funkiness, like this leaf that's been cut out here. So my students would graduate to collating codicological funkiness. Then what I did after downloading them is I called up my local print shop, shout out Paradise Copies in Northampton, Massachusetts, and they make booklets and pamphlets all the time. And they said that it would be no problem to print this out for me on double-sided color paper and then fold everything into choirs. So I then uploaded, so after downloading my JPEGs, I uploaded them to a Google Drive folder, which I had planned to send Paradise Copies. And a couple of things I want to point out here. I've circled booklet. What I learned through the process, I had initially labeled it choir, is you have to use language that they understand. They're used to making booklets. So I wasn't going to use medieval codicological terminology. Number 2, even though this kind of hurt my heart a little bit, I numbered my JPEGs not according to folios with recto and verso, but as if they were in a printed book. Again, the software program that they use understood that. Final note, here's the stub. I was going to have to cut out the leaf to simulate that missing leaf myself. So I put in 2 dummy folios or 2 dummy JPEGs to represent that cut out leaf, which is just a beige block of JPEG right there. So they printed it out for me. They folded everything. I told them not to staple things because the next step was to sew my choirs, which I did at home. Here is the step 1 of my doing this. I used a safety pin as instead of an awl to poke sewing stations into my choir. And then I had a sewing kit like for sewing hems. So I just used that. I then stapled the choirs together from each manuscript. And then in the case of this one, I cut out the missing folio to make my stub. On the left, you can see a photo of the actual manuscript of the Free Library of Philadelphia. And on the right is my mock-up. So it's not perfect, but it's close. So everything ready, I then assembled 8 packets, 3 of which I was able to drop off at the houses of students who live in my area. And for the other 5, I went to the post office to send them to farther afield in Massachusetts, a student in South Carolina, 1 in Tennessee, and a student in Brasilia in Brazil, minus the ink because I wasn't sure about sending liquids internationally. So in total, shipping and packing cost $105. So all told, producing 8 teaching kits and sending them to students amounted to $585, leaving me $85 over budget and out of pocket. Nor did the adventure go entirely smoothly. Louis DeJoy has done much to weaken our vital US postal service or postal system. And one of the upshots was a very, very delayed arrival to my student in Tennessee. And after the parcel sent to Brazil was tracked to Sao Paulo, it fell off the face of the earth and never arrived at the door of my student in Brasilia. She was and remains completely gracious about it, but I can't avoid blame for not thinking properly about how to serve my international students and particularly those living in the global South. We did our best to find alternatives so she could participate in the activities, but the fault is this is my fault here. So finally, we worked these materials into the course in the following ways. With respect to paleography, as part of their education in learning how to transcribe Proto-Gothic text, although I know that I'm showing you unseal here on the screen, I had them attempt to write it, which we did together in class using the quill, ink, drawing paper, tracing paper, blotting rag, and practice Proto-Gothic text. I played ambient lo-fi music in the background while we did this, and my students really appreciated, or so they said, that sort of relaxing activity together. The Pragmatics of Authorship. One of the topics we addressed were medieval theories of authorship, theories about how Hildegard herself composed and the relationship between the idealized visualization of her at her wax tablet in the famous Rupertsberg illumination that you're looking at here. And so I recorded myself godlike or St. John-like dictating verses from Revelation. I uploaded that recording of me dictate to our course page. And I asked students before class to transcribe what I had dictated onto their wax tablets as much as they could remember. And then when we met back in class, I had them transcribe what was on their wax tablets onto their drawing paper in an effort at emulating Proto-Gothic text. And then when we went to address collation, we used the quires I told you about. And we also learned how to produce collation formulas from them. We used the paper mock-up of an animal skin in order to learn how scribes produced bifolia from them. So we folded that together. And then finally, the parchment scraps afforded my students some tactile engagement with the writing support. And when thinking about books themselves as bodies, I had students prepare the parchment to accept ink by using the sandpaper, write on them with their quills and ink, and then in the next week's class, use a sharp object to scrape away their work, emulating medieval scribal practices of erasure. So the semester hasn't ended yet, and it would be premature of me to offer a debrief, which I think needs more distance and reflection, and most importantly, feedback from my students. So I'll conclude here by saying that I look forward to your comments and to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'll get started. I also need to share my screen. Okay, all right, thanks, Sonia. That was really wonderful. And repeating thanks to everyone. My name's Rachel King. I'm an associate professor in the English department at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I mainly work on 18th century literature. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from a location in Santa Barbara, the traditional lands of the coastal Chumash people, and to recognize any elders past and present and acknowledge them here. So my talk is going to explore the Ballator project, which is a project that I direct at UCSB in collaboration with faculty from California State University, Northridge, and Howard University. And we're funded by the NEH and the UC HBCU initiative, and I'll talk about both of those. And I'm going to think about, I'll introduce the project, but then also think about how it relates to questions of decolonization and structural racism in archival studies. So the Ballator project is a project to research, digitize, and computationally analyze the Ballator collection, where you have the OAC guide here, with a team of faculty, graduate students, and undergraduate students and librarians from all three of the universities I mentioned. And some of the students are here today, so thank you for coming. It's great to see you. The collection, which is held at UCSB Library's Special Research Collections, is an archive of about 2,500 18th and 19th century journals, letters, and other documents relating to the Anglo-Irish Quaker community that was centered in Ballator, Ireland. And that, actually, there still are Quakers in Ballator, and I'll show some photos of those. So the materials were first assembled by the 19th century author Mary Ledbetter, whose brother, father, and grandfather, all of the last name Shackleton, were all headmasters of the Ballator School. Where she was educated, that's where Ledbetter was educated, and which also educated most famously Edmund Burke. So Burke has this connection to the collection. Ledbetter herself produced several volumes out of the assembled papers. So this is partly why she brought them together, including the Ledbetter papers, which is commonly known as Annals of Ballator, and then Memoirs and Letters of Richard and Elizabeth Shackleton, her parents. So it's a fascinating collection for a variety of reasons, but more importantly, I think the content intersects with questions of access and exclusion in archives in really important ways. And the project is as much about those questions as it is about researching the contents. So first of all, why is this collection interesting in terms of the contents? For one thing, it's largely unknown, or at least not very well researched. It's very well cataloged, and the librarians have done a wonderful job with it, but literary scholars, historians, even Quaker historians just haven't done that much work with it. So one of the really interesting connections is Quakers' connection to the history of abolitionism. And so these are just some excerpts from Thomas Clarkson's history about the role that Quakers played in this movement. The Bellator Quakers corresponded and interacted with many prominent Quaker abolitionists, Rebecca Jones, John Woolman, Anthony Benezet. Edmund Burke was not himself a Quaker, but as I said, was educated there. So there's this, they're very, it's right at the time period that this movement is gaining a lot of steam, and there's a lot of these prominent Quaker abolitionists in the collection. It's also a really interesting collection in terms of questions of women's writing, women's education, women's ministry within Quakerism. Quakers allowed women to be ministers. They were sort of a theoretically egalitarian society, although of course there are structural hierarchies in play. But all of those topics are really prominent, especially with Mary Ledbetter collecting the papers herself. And then I think there's a really interesting question too about how these issues play out in provincial locations. And so here's Bellator in relationship to Dublin. The top right picture is the Quaker meeting house that's still there. I think that a lot of book historical research is often focused on cities. And so here we have this very interesting provincial community, all sorts of issues around colonialism there too, because these are Anglo-Irish people. They came over from Yorkshire earlier in the 18th century. But I think again, in terms of like the content, that's another really interesting aspect of the collection. But when you start to read through and really get into it, you realize that these topics are generally fairly intermittent, right? The majority of the discussion is about religion, Quakerism, accounts of Quaker meetings, which although are, primarily silent, a lot happens, and people's health is really probably the primary topic. Abolition comes up, but fairly rarely. There are so far as we've seen so far, no Black authors in the collection, no named Black people, even though formerly enslaved people are sort of sometimes referred to, or enslaved people. So replicating overall the way that the white abolitionist movement often presented itself, and going back to Clarkson's history, which I showed a minute ago, it's a 900-page history of the abolitionist movement that does not name one single Black person. And so that aspect of white abolitionism in this period is really present here in the Bellator collection. So it's a clear example of how the history of the power of who has access to documents and who puts together a collection influences what kind of history it can tell. And this has also been reinforced by the archiving and cataloging, which is excellent, very, very thorough. I'm not in any way, critiquing the librarians, but it's, like many collections, it's organized in this biographical way that again sort of highlights the white abolitionist working here. So in researching the collection, my priority has been to try to not replicate this structural hierarchy and to emphasize the particular vantage points that underrepresented scholars have on these materials. So since 2017, this work has been taking place in collaborative research teams, and we've produced 3 pieces of collaborative scholarship that are currently forthcoming. So in the summer of 2019, 5 students from Howard University traveled to UCSB to research the collection through the UC HBCU initiative, a program whose goal is to increase the representation of Black students in UC PhD programs through these kinds of research internships. And here's the students using our pull press at UCSB. We set type from a poem by Mary Ledbetter and then printed the poem. So the students displayed an attunement to questions of power and absence in archives as they drew connections among the kinds of exclusion we observed and how some of these kinds obviously mattered more to the Bellator Quakers than others did. So for example, Danielle Knox pursued research into the issue of exogamy, that is marrying outside Quakerism, and excommunication after reading a booklet of transcribed letters about two women, Sarah Dale and Sarah Rayner, who were both chastised for marrying outside Quakerism. So she found this booklet about these women. At the same time, Bishop Lawton highlighted a poem by Mary Ledbetter that is ostensibly abolitionist, but only, again, names white figures. So it's supposed to be an abolitionist poem, but it only is referring to white abolitionists. And the students ended up connecting these topics to think about how women's participation in Quakerism, even when it's about those women who were excluded from the community, is a topic of active debate for the Bellator Quakers, while the omission of Black figures in abolitionist writings is not obvious to them, right? Like they just kind of don't notice one of those questions while they're very interested in the other one. The students' previous education at an HBCU and their variety of perspectives on these issues was a crucial research tool. And another group of Howard students with one overlap, Trey Merritt is coming back, will be participating in the research internship this summer. So the project is continuing through both the UC-HBCU initiative and now also a grant in the NEH Humanities Initiatives at Hispanic Serving Institutions program that has allowed us to expand the collaboration to include CSUN alongside Howard. So in this phase of the project, we're combining archival research with computational analysis to ask how shifting our frame towards big data can help us see the collection in new ways. And again, there's a close connection between the intellectual and structural goals of the project, as the digital humanities like book history and archival studies remains a field that's disproportionately white. So there's this pedagogical aspect of introducing the skills, as well as a belief that we can use these methods to understand the collection in new ways. So the UCSB library is in the process of digitizing the collection with archival quality scans. We've gotten 3 out of 14 boxes digitized at this point. And then I'm working with a team of 11 students from CSUN and UCSB and 4 PhD students and Professor Danielle Spratt from CSUN, who's also here today, to transcribe the collection to make it available for computational analysis. And this has involved teaching the students 18th century paleography, which is not as difficult as medieval paleography, but still is a training process, and hosting twice weekly transcription sessions over Zoom. And of course, we were planning to do this in person, but we've shifted to Zoom. So right now we just store things in a Google Drive, and I just wanted to, I can talk about practicalities, but just wanted to show that. So that's sort of the platform we're using so far. And a big part of my interest is in introducing students to the human labor of these apparently disembodied processes of digitization, to think about the categories that we choose for metadata, to think about the choices that we make in, whether or not to modernize spelling and abbreviations, these sort of things, just to show them that those choices are ones that are made by people, right? Even though we're sort of preparing it for computational analysis. This isn't a huge collection, but it's big enough to both benefit from computational approach and yield interesting and significant results. And so the 2 primary methods that we're planning to use, we haven't started yet, so these are samples, are topic modeling and network analysis, and I could talk more about why we're focusing on those to begin with. But in both cases, I think we're really hoping to just see the collection in different ways, and try to get around that biographical orientation of the way that it has been split into, recipient and correspondent. So I hope these methods allow us to decenter the white perspective of the collection a bit by moving away from its current organization. But I'm also always aware of the structural challenges in diversifying digital humanities. Both Howard and CSUN have robust interest in DH, but they don't have the large scale resources of UCSB in this area. And so that's a kind of structural hierarchy that gives me pause. I'm always aware of myself as the white PI of this project, trying not to impose my research agenda onto other researchers. One commitment of the project, as I said, is to pursue collaborative publication opportunities, which we've been fairly successful with so far, but in the humanities, that's still less common, and so it can be a little tricky, actually. But I think really, my primary goal is always to keep these overlapping structural and intellectual issues front and center, whether we're talking about the 18th century Ballator Quakers or about our own work on the Ballator collection. Thanks a lot.
Hi, everyone. I'm sharing my screen, and I'm also going to give you some links in the chat before we get started. The Folgers websites are down today, so I can follow up with you if you're interested in information about the Folger materials. Okay, so my name is Marissa Nicosia, and I'm an assistant professor of Renaissance literature at Penn State Abington. I'm speaking today from the unceded ancestral lands of the Lenape people in Philadelphia. And this project was that I'm running and speaking about today is co-run with collaborators, who I'll introduce in a minute. Through Penn State Abington's Undergraduate Research Activities Initiative, I collaborate with colleagues Christina Riemann-Murphy, Reference and Instruction Librarian at Penn State Abington, and Heather Froelich, Literary Informatics Librarian at Penn State University Libraries, to mentor students who are enrolled in an ongoing independent study called What's in a Recipe? We work closely with students as they complete transcription, editing, and analysis of one specific 17th century recipe book each year through the Folger Shakespeare Library's Dromio platform as part of the larger Early Modern Manuscripts Online, EMO projects, and the Early Modern Recipes Online Collective, MROC projects. In addition to learning about early modern manuscripts and practicing paleography, our students consider how manuscript material requires additional layers of editorial intervention, and our students develop independent research projects that use an array of methods and approaches. In this presentation, co-written with my collaborators but presented by me today, I will consider these questions. What can students learn by editing manuscripts using a digital interface? And how does working with digitally mediated material texts empower students as researchers? First, some information about the project. The Abington College Undergraduate Research Activities program pairs students and faculty in multi-semester research experiences. Students receive credit, gain research experience, and present their work at an annual campus poster fair. Many students have decided to join our project after participating in a transcribe-a-thon event or completing a short transcription activity in one of my classes. Where this undergraduate research project happens matters. Penn State's Abington College is a small 4-year local serving public Commonwealth campus near Philadelphia. We're actually the farthest campus from the University Central Hub and State College. At this campus of nearly 4,000 undergraduates, students tend to have significant financial need, and more than a third of our students are first-generation college students. We are the most diverse campus within the Penn State system. I started this project in 2016, but all 3 project leaders have worked with students on the same manuscript for the past 2 cohorts of 2019, 2020, and 2020, 2021 students. And I will draw my examples from their work with a 17th century recipe book. Recipe book is a term that encompasses a wide range of handwritten books containing medicinal and culinary preparations. And these manuscripts were produced and used in England, Europe, and America between the 16th and the 19th centuries. It's a big category, and these manuscripts are also commonly referred to as manuscript cookbooks and receipt books. The manuscript that we've been working on since early 2019 is Folger Shelf Mark VB380 and described in the catalog as an English cookery and medicine book. It's dated to about 1677 based on the paper, and it is associated with a person named Anne Western. Her name appears in annotations throughout the manuscript, and you can see it in the margins all over this opening on the screen. But her name doesn't appear in an inscription early in the work, which conventionally conveys ownership. And there's been discussion in the Folger records among MROC members, including myself, and among my students and collaborators about what Anne Western's role is in relation to this manuscript. She may be a user of the manuscript. She may be someone who is preparing a new manuscript based on this manuscript. Or maybe she was thinking about publishing a cookbook and was using her name as a part of a marking system. We don't quite know. It's one of the big questions we still have about this text. Now, I received my own training in paleography from Heather Wolf, curator Folger, of manuscripts at the Folger, in a course at Rare Book School that I took with Rachel, actually. Following what Heather taught me, as well as the Folger and MROC transcription guidance and the Learn by Doing pedagogy of Peter Stallybrass, one of my mentors in graduate school and the first person who ever showed me secretary hand, my students begin doing the real work at the first project meeting. I share a handout with some secretary hand letter forms and abbreviations. We begin reading the manuscript in the round together, and then I assist and answer student questions as they begin their individual transcription using the Folger Dromio interface, which was developed as a teaching and transcription tool. After even an hour of transcribing together in person or on Zoom, students have become familiar enough with the process to continue transcribing on their own. When you open a manuscript in Dromio, you get a box that looks like this, with a number of helpful buttons that allow for transcription as well as encoding and deal with some of the abbreviations that are normally seen in manuscripts. You can just click a button for the YE that's rendered as the, as well as the that, your, the with, and the which. There are also buttons here that help you encode deletions, insertions, marks, gaps, and superscript texts, following the practices that you would use if you were simply doing a transcription in a Word document. Now, when you click save, the Folger system saves your work. It saves both your text and how you've encoded these abbreviations and other features. And when you click done, the Folger counts your transcription as one of the 3 that each page of the manuscript will undergo before vetting. Experienced and expert paleographers, inexperienced, novices, people at all stages will come up with different readings of the same line based on the letter forms they see, the punctuation they see, and other features on the page. At present, the Folger is working with seasoned paleographers to vet transcriptions, to compare 3 transcriptions of each line on each page, check the XML tagging, and to make a 4th corrected version of the transcribed manuscript. And some of these are currently available online. Now, there are multiple layers of engagement at work here. The initial compiler or compilers of the manuscript created the first level and layer of text on the page. Later users read, annotated, and prepared medicines or food from this manuscript. Transcribers who create new readable versions of the manuscript original make editorial choices while they copy the text. We can most clearly see these various layers of engagement with the text on recipes where there are comments, crossouts, and emendations. This recipe for marmalade of apricots has been crossed out. The user has accompanied their crossouts with "not this" in the margin and "no" at the end. However, we can still read this recipe, and according to the principles of semi-diplomatic transcription, it should be included in the record of the manuscript. Multiple layers of intervention are at work here. The original compiler, the 17th or 18th century user who determined that this recipe was not valuable, the student interpreting the letter forms and generating a transcription, the buttons and XML tags overlaying the text, and the remediation of the information across multiple software platforms and file formats. There are many, many cases like this one in VB 380. This next example, a recipe for Mrs. King's Cakes, shows further editorial engagement by an early user. Below the main text, there is an attribution noting that Aunt Cartwright likely gave this recipe to the original compiler. The right-hand marginal comment states, the quantity of butter is not set down, but I believe it is a pound. But again, the left margin bears the note, not this, and the recipe is crossed out, and the butter note is also crossed out. One last example. This recipe to sweeten the blood was not crossed out, but it was highly annotated in interesting ways. It includes notes on preparation for human or animal use. So the original recipe is attributed to Dr. Coatsworth, and the clarifying notes on how to use this recipe to prepare pigs for slaughter are attributed to Mrs. Hockley. There are two signatures from Anne Western as well, marking both Mrs. Hockley's animal version of the recipe and Dr. Coatsworth's human version of the recipe. So 3 or 4 different individuals were involved in the making of this recipe as it currently exists in VB 380. Dr. Coatsworth, Anne Western, Mrs. Hockley, and perhaps an initial compiler who is a different person altogether. It's hard to determine exactly where to locate these notes alongside the transcription, as the page layout is one thing we cannot quite replicate in Dromio or Word or even XML. You may have already noticed that the different students' transcriptions have looked pretty different across these 3 slides, and that's because they arranged this material differently in the Word docs that they submitted after they copy and pasted their work from Dromio into Word for our class files. The primary materials on which one would base an edition of VB 380 through documentary editing include this wide variety of marks, attributions, and interactivity. An edition, however, is not our ultimate project goal, but rather part of the Folger's ongoing work, which will be guided by the locational, contextual tags entered by transcribers doing the day-to-day work of transcription. After our students complete their transcription, they use multiple modes of analysis to develop individual research projects and to share their work. We follow an open or multimodal pedagogy model here that is led by student inquiry. These modes of inquiry that we've tried together and have shaped student projects have included variously working with digital collections and physical rare books, practicing secretary hand with goose quills. We mailed them from Scribble Workshop this year, cooking recipes, and using web-based text analysis tools such as Voyant. These methods have generated research presentations for the annual fair in person and online, creating posters and interactive stations for a public open event, and writing for public audiences. These few final slides showcase practices and student work. So testing recipes with students in the Acura test kitchen, looking at ingredient frequency in Voyant tools. And here's some final work that students produced last year. Alexis Amacon created a zine about ecofeminism based on her work on VB 380. And Amanda Pickett used distant reading tools to analyze the scientific vocabulary in medicinal recipes and wrote about one recipe for the MROC blog. This group also put together a public history pop-up event with stations where attendees could practice writing in secretary hand with goose quills and smell medicinal recipe ingredients. Right now, our current students are writing ingredient biographies of oranges, rosewater, and agrimony, and how those ingredients appear in VB 380 for submission to public-facing venues that might include our campus news magazine, as well as public blogs. Now, none of this is possible without support: physical spaces, financial support, logistical support, and the expertise and time of the project leaders and so many other people. So I'd like to thank all of the different funding bodies and collectives of people who make this project possible. And I look forward to your questions in the Q&A.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yael Rice, and I'm Assistant Professor of Art History and Asian Languages and Civilizations at Amherst College, where I teach courses broadly and specifically centered around Islamic and South Asian art history. I want to echo the various thanks that have already been said to RBS for making all of this possible, to Marissa for rallying those of us on this panel together. It's really a pleasure to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So today I want to focus on 3 relatively brief exercises that I used in Arts of the Islamic Book, an art history course that I taught at Amherst College in fall 2019. Those of you who are not familiar with Amherst College, it's a small liberal arts college in Western Massachusetts. So it has an exclusively undergraduate student body, though with our proximity to UMass Amherst on the road, I do occasionally work with grad students. And actually in this iteration of the course, I had 1 graduate student from UMass in it, but mostly undergrads. This course did not presume any prior knowledge of Islamic art or manuscripts, nor did it require literacy in any of the languages or scripts that were and continue to be used in the Islamic world. And in fact, most of the students lacked knowledge of these languages and scripts. And those that did possess literacy in Arabic, Turkish, Persian, or Urdu, to name just a few of the relevant languages, these students were nevertheless unfamiliar with pre-modern paleography and codicology. So the 3 exercises I'll be introducing today were among the approaches I adapted to introduce this diverse range of students, some possessing knowledge of relevant alphabetic systems, some not, to the practices of making quires and transferring drawings, and to digital approaches to the study of manuscripts. In addition to engaging with these exercises, students were also asked to write a 5-page physical analysis paper focusing on one of 2 19th century Iranian manuscripts in Amherst Archives and Special Collections. And they also had to complete a final project researching a manuscript of their choosing. I will not be discussing those assignments in today's presentation, but I'd be happy to touch upon them further during the Q&A. The first exercise for this course invited students to make a quire or gathering comprising 16 pages or 8 folios. Students could pick any text to copy, and these were exclusively, in this case, in English. And if they wish, they could add ornamentation and illustrations. Really, the goal of this practicum was to provide students a material introduction to the processes of folding sheets of paper, to make bifolia, and to laying out a fine text over a set number of pages. Exercise, as some of you will recognize, drew heavily from Sarah Werner's excellent Making a Quarto assignment, which is available to view and download from her website, but with some minor changes. For one, students had to include catchwords, the standard method of pagination employed in Islamic manuscripts. They were also given supplemental technical readings from Francois Doroche's Islamic Codicology, an introduction to the study of manuscripts in Arabic script, which you see a sort of fragment of on the left. and an excerpt from Adam Gottschalk's Arabic manuscripts Avade Mekom for readers, which you see on the right, and they could consult these to learn about catchwords, to learn about sort of the typical collation of Islamic manuscripts. The students' choirs in the end ranged from the relatively unadorned, though the example you see here on the right employed multiple inks for the copying of the text title and author, to the more ornately decorated, as we can see with this example, which reproduces an excerpt from Jamaica Kincaid's short story Girl, but uses headpieces and illustration to stretch the selection of text over the 16 pages. So this is also a lesson in planning and layout. For the next material exercise, students were asked to employ one of two drawing transfer processes described in an article on 15th century Persian drawing techniques by the art historian David Roxburgh. So that was a kind of supplementary piece that they had to consult to complete the exercise. Both of these processes necessitated the use of charcoal and tracing and drawing paper. One of these, which employed pouncing, also required the use of a stylus or similar type of instrument. I supplied students with the charcoal and papers. This came out to maybe $15. I bought the charcoal, I could have actually taken it from my wood stove, but I didn't. Students had to source the other materials, including the printer required to print the template. Fortunately, this was during the before times, that is pre-COVID, so students were able to use resources available locally on their campuses. The templates themselves were drawn from a collection of hundreds of 14th and 15th century Persian manuscript workshop drawings that were at one point compiled in a group of albums today known as the Dietz albums, after the German diplomat who acquired them in Istanbul around 1789. And these albums today live in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. I pre-selected from this group of over 400 drawings, 6 drawings, which I'm showing you here, that due to the simplicity and boldness of their design would be relatively easy to transfer using the pouncing and carbon copy methods outlined in Roxburgh's article. The goal of this exercise was to introduce students to the practical dimensions of illustrative copying techniques used in royal manuscript workshops in Iran and Central Asia during the pre-modern period. Indeed, during a class discussion following the completion of the exercise, one student described the experience of transferring his chosen design as quote unquote tedious, which seemed to me a rather valuable insight, actually. But more than that, the exercise invited students to think about how these processes are integral to the construction of single manuscript pages. As Roxburgh has shown, for example, book specialists often built up full page compositions in Persian manuscripts, that is illustrative compositions, through the joining together of multiple discrete design units, like the ones we see here. The Persian Manuscript Workshop also produced designs for transfer onto other media, as in the example of the cloud collar in the upper right. Thus, during both the exercise and in discussions afterwards in class, students reflected upon the important role that manuscript painters working with paper played in the creation and transfer of designs onto or into textiles, hard stone objects, and other kinds of media. The final exercise for this course took a different turn, as it focused on studying manuscripts through a digital humanities lens. Since the course is not DH or digital humanities focused, and this exercise was the only DH-oriented exercise I was asking students to complete, I kept the goals and the sort of instructions for the exercise very simple. In short, I wanted students, firstly, to begin to think about manuscripts as data, and data that can be collected and structured to be analyzed and compared. And secondly, I wanted them to model the kinds of collaborative work that is integral both to DH scholarship and long has been central to the processes of making books. This exercise took 2 parts. In the first, students worked together as a class, and I'm just gonna shift here. In In the first, students worked together as a class to populate the column headings in a Google Sheets spreadsheet for 4 manuscripts of the Shahnameh, or Book of Kings, an early 11th century Persian language history of the mythical and real kings of Iran. And all 4 of these manuscripts are kept in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. The availability of extensively cataloged metadata and images on the digital Walters website made it an especially appropriate collection with which to work. So turning to the spreadsheet, which I actually set this up for them, I essentially filled in A through G columns, and then they had to fill in the rest. We can see that students elected to focus on physical features that could be compared across all 4 manuscripts, from the sizes of the page. And of course, they had to figure out that they needed a separate column for height versus width. And then someone figured out, well, then we should calculate area, to rates of illustration. And this kind of goes a little further. For the second part of the exercise, the students were divided into 4 groups, each of which had to then catalog 20 pages or 10 folios from one of the 4 Shahnameh manuscripts. Once again, they had to create their own data fields using the metadata provided by the Digital Walters website and drawn from their own observations of the digitized pages. Each group could work entirely independently, meaning that their data columns did not have to match those created by any of the other groups. And actually in our discussions afterward, it was productive to think about the different types of columns each group arrived at. In the event, most of the groups had data fields had kind of similar data fields like folio number, folio side, but others were wholly unique. This group number 4, for example, created separate data columns to record the spaces reserved for chapter and section headings. They also documented the incidence of catchwords and the frequency of variations in text directions. This was the extent of the data exercise. So to be clear, students were not required to do any further data collection or structuring, nor to clean the data or make visualizations. The point instead was to provoke discussion about the complexities and potential for studying manuscripts through a data-centric and computational framework. And to echo some of what Rachel said earlier, this was really an opportunity for all of us to see these objects through differently. After completing the exercise, students were primed to ask new questions, new kinds of questions of the manuscripts we were studying, and to imagine alternative approaches that address the manuscripts as a whole as whole objects composed of multiple parts. At least 3 students chose to focus on Walters manuscripts for their final projects, while the others worked on digitized manuscripts accessible through the websites of the British Library, the University of Pennsylvania Library, and Princeton University's library. Each, some to a greater extent than others, brought a DH-informed aerial perspective to their study, and a few even utilized Google Sheets to structure and sort their metadata. These kinds of practical exercises enrich the close reading and looking that we much more regularly ask our students to do. By creating a choir, transferring a drawing, and collectively defining and filling in a data set, students engage with the richness of manuscript culture beyond the abstract. In these acts of making and doing, they create and execute choices. For just a moment, they too become manuscript makers, codicologists, and museum and library catalogers, with all of the richness, the challenges, and indeed the tediousness that those roles entail. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I know that some folks in the audience are eager to ask some questions. And while giving them some time to put in their questions in the chat box, I would like to take advantage of my prerogative as a moderator to ask the first question to the whole panel. And actually, all your presentations made me reflect on my own teaching, especially my first year seminar titled The Global History of Letter Writing that I offered here at Emory in fall 2020. And due to the shift to the remote instruction, I also had to put together the digitized research packet uploaded to the course website, which was comprised of some digitized images of letters, both manuscripts and types selected and scanned from Emory's special collection. And for the first session with these digitized materials, I have introduced my students to some highlights from Emory's special collections in a speed date style to attract their attention. And one example that I showed to them was Barack Obama's letter to her girlfriend in his college years, Alexandra McNear, which Emory purchased in 2017. And the problem that I had with this digitized version of this particular letter was that all traces of folding were gone, and more seriously, the hue of the paper, which was written originally on yellow legal pad, was misrepresented in some strange greenish tone. And because I was the only one who consulted this particular letter in its physical form, I found myself explicating what the real letter actually looks like. And later, toward the end of the semester, my students read an article about epistolary etiquette in Indonesia, where letter writers express their emotions with colors of ink and papers, as well as some particular ways in which they folded their letters, because the verbal expression of emotions is strongly disapproved in Indonesian society. And based upon this reading, my students circled back to their observation of the letter written by Obama, who actually spent part of his childhood in Indonesia, and discussed the loss of vital material information in digitized forms, as well as both advantages and disadvantages of using digital tools in the study of material text. So going back to all your presentations, I was just wondering if you guys can elaborate a little bit more on how we could constructively handle what we've lost in the process of digitization in both our research and teaching.
So I can start by saying that my work with students on Folger Shakespeare Library manuscripts has been entirely digital even before the pandemic, although we did used to meet in the library lab classroom and work together with the same technologies to do that. So I've been teaching through where the manuscripts are accessed through a digital interface for a while. And you're right, color, weight, scale, size, and even actually keeping in mind what the substrate the manuscripts are written on are things that just you're not made as continually aware of as when you're working with the physical object. So even after a number of months in the all Zoom version of the project where we couldn't go and see any physical materials, I had a student say, wait, is this on paper again, or is this on parchment? And I was like, okay, let's stop. The substrate is paper. It's woven paper. And I kind of went through my 17th century paper little mini lecture just to make sure. And we'd done that earlier on, but it didn't stick because it wasn't the same experience of interactivity.
Yeah, I can follow up with that. I mean, particularly because my class it centers the idea of mediation. No matter what I'm showing my students, whether it is and the labels that I put on my slides for this are laconic. I actually should have written a photograph that I took with my phone of a photographic print that was sent to me as a JPEG of a manuscript that was produced in the 12th century. So, and I produce, I provide even more information usually, but regardless, I have my students look at whatever images I'm showing them, and I ask them, well, take a step back, what are we missing here? Okay, well, there's nothing that gives us a sense of scale. So there's no hand. This was taken in a particular set of lighting conditions. So that's happening. And so on and so forth, just as I would with any kind of artifact, any three-dimensional artifact. So I'm constantly drawing my students' attention to that sort of thing. But to sort of modify your question, Huisang, a little bit, one of the things that I have my students focus on is what information is accrued, what information is added to the digital object. And I'll just give two really brief examples before we move on. Number one is, well, it's framed by a particular repository, right? So its institutional history and its location right now add information and modify how we interpret that object, that manuscript. And number two, and I was looking, and I'm so sorry I've forgotten the name of the authors. I will find the article and cite it in the chat if I can. But a manuscript of the Canterbury Tales, there is a microfilm of it from early in the 20th century that shows an annotation with an ownership mark that was in the foredge margin, I believe. The manuscript as it exists now does not have that ownership mark. It's been erased. It's been rubbed over time through people handling the manuscript. So sometimes we need to think about what we mean by authenticity. Is that microfilm from the early 20th century more authentic to the real object than the real object is to itself now? And these are the sorts of issues that speaking about digitized manuscripts can have us discuss, and I think that it's fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are also both, things that you gain and things that you lose, obviously. Sorry, my computer started to tip over. I mean, in this, with the Ballator letters, it really forced us, again, to think about just the human process of digitization. For example, we had to really think about what constitutes a document within the collection, right? Is a document a single letter? Is it a journal, a booklet of letters? Is it a folder of documents? And so right now we're working with the definition that a document is a single letter, but sometimes there are packets of transcribed letters. How do you break those down? And I think those things are, I think it would be much more intuitive if we were looking at the physical objects and they could see, okay, this folded sheet of paper, which turns into a 4-page, bifolium, is a single letter, a single document. And it's hard when what they're looking at is 4 JPEGs. On the other hand, and then the times when it's like, the corner is folded over a word and you're like, if I were there with the document, I could just fold that corner down, but I can't. But I think on the other hand, there are these advantages, especially for students who are beginning paleography, in being able to zoom in and zoom out, to change the contrast, to look at the documents in different ways on their screens. And I've noticed, it's funny, like when we're doing these kind of group sessions, and some students will share their screens to ask questions about particular words. Like some of them are looking at it really zoomed in and some of them look at it really zoomed out. And it's like it works better for some than for others. So yeah, I mean, I think there are, of course, pluses and minuses, but it's helpful to focus maybe not just on what we're losing in the digital format.
I'm just going to add very briefly that throughout the course that I teach, a running theme is the importance and the valence of copying and copies and the authority of the copy. And that's part of what that transfer exercise is supposed to do. So I think, as others of the panelists have raised, I mean, we can sort of unpack and question this whole idea of the original as the total authentic object. But by the same token, I think, kind of moving in between. So I do have students look at manuscripts. They have to actually analyze a manuscript, so that when we jump into actually we're always in the digital, but when we're more clearly in the digital realm, they can at least have that kind of the haptic somatic experience of encountering a book, a handmade book. To fill in some of the gaps and hopefully to ask other questions.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And there were a couple of questions asked to the individual panelists. So Sonia, I saw that there was some conversation going on about Scribes Toolkit that people could purchase. So do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so Ruth Rogers mentions in the chat that at Wellesley College, they have actual scribal toolkits. And I think that, given more funding, if people have more funding, then certainly make use of the services of those who can create more, professional kits. I didn't have that kind of funding, and I wanted to make them oh, excuse me. And Ruth mentions that it is one kit, but it is in the collection, and I was doing this remotely. So I wanted to send it out to each of the students. And there was a question in the chat, I believe by Shafiq, and I think, so I hope I have the right person, saying something along the lines of, I don't think that I could do that, or at least create the choirs myself. And all I want to say is that I can't even sew my own hems. I have my husband do it for me. I am very, very bad with these things other than typing. I'm a magnificent typist. So I hope that's encouraging to say that actually it can be done quite simply, and that because of the positive feedback that I've gotten here, I hope it would be helpful if I uploaded a video somewhere, maybe to my personal website, of my producing one of these choirs. Marissa is shaking her head, yes. So I will do that. I will make another one of these choirs, and I will upload it somewhere, and hopefully it will be publicized so people can follow along my very poor sewing skills at home. So I'll leave that for now.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be really useful for many of us. Yeah, so for the other novices who are not familiar with putting together the choir. Okay, and there was another question for Yale by M.A. Johnson. Yeah, let me just read the question. What instrument was used for pouncing? I have pounced drawings of a modern Slavic iconographer in my collection. Just so pounced drawings from the 18th century that were apparently for amusement as a parlor game in England, using the pounced image to create drawings that were colored in various ways.
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned, I actually kept my kit relatively minimal. I did not get into sort of a lot of the technical aspects of, for example, the stylus, etc. And I left it open to students to actually figure out what instruments they would use, because I wanted them to actually go through that process of figuring that out and to find something in the home. Not this thing that was, here's a thing called the stylus and I send it to you, now use it, which is also a great learning experience. But, so whether they were using like a safety pin or, any number of tools that could be adapted for that purpose. And I might do it differently next time. But really my goal here wasn't so much about attempting to kind of replicate some kind of historical process, but for students to experience sort of one aspect of making, and to reflect on that.
Okay, that's great. And by Hein Goschalk, yeah, please forgive me if I pronounce your name incorrectly. Yeah, my name is likewise really difficult to pronounce, but yeah, I'm in the same issue. So he asked questions for Rachel and Sonia, but let me start from the other question for Rachel first. You mentioned a great point about how the manuscript collection is cataloged. May I ask, would you say that there is some bias in how manuscript collections are cataloged?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And I think a lot of scholars, I mean, it's a really great question, but a lot of scholars in archival studies, have worked on this question and thinking about the kinds of biases that are built into, even just the way that you catalog a collection. For example, there's a great article by Melissa Adler and Lindsay Harper that I think was in a special issue of archival studies. So definitely librarians are working on this question. And, I'm not sure that I mean, it's, certainly I can't maybe suggest a better method, but I think just to be aware of the fact that when you organize a collection by the person writing or receiving a letter, that you're choosing to obviously foreground a certain perspective in doing that. So for example, that's why one of the metadata categories that we collect in this process is people mentioned, because I think it's actually much more common that those prominent abolitionists that I was talking about are coming into the collection when they're mentioned by the people writing. So they do actually, there are letters from them as well in the collection, but they show up much more often when the Ballator Quakers are talking about them. And I think that's a really fascinating aspect of this group of people is constituting itself as a group of abolitionists, right? Anytime abolition comes up, they're like, oh yeah, we are totally abolitionists, like that is what we believe. But it's not, it's literally not central. And so I think, again, that's why these computational methods can actually allow us to see that in different ways. If we can graph people mentioned versus the people writing and receiving the letters. And again, that's still a biographical organization, but just trying to shift to think of different ways to break up and organize the collection that's maybe not that traditional, to and from category. But thanks for that question.
So if I may, let me ask you a follow-up question. So as we've corresponded before this event, I was really curious about the ways in which your sensitivity to the power relations and hierarchy embedded in the archival practices resonate with more extreme cases like the transatlantic slavery or some scholarly issues emerging from the Native American and indigenous studies. So I'm now thinking about some concept by Saidiya Hartman, The Critical Fabulation, or Michelle Wolf-Troilus' book, The Silencing the Past, or Vincent Brown's The Ripper's Garden, and so on and so forth. So how do you think your project would resonate with the kind of discourse going on in African American studies and NAIS?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're definitely hoping to be in conversation with those kinds of theories that are circulating. And my student, we do a series of readings in the project, alongside the actual transcribing and digitizing work. We have a week. So in the summer program, we also do a weekly seminar where we're reading these kinds of, so we read Hartman. Students really, really love her work for sure. In this collection so far, and I think this will remain the case, we don't have the types of issues that she and others talk about in terms of the violence of the archive, right? We're not encountering that really viscerally difficult material where the enslaved people who do show up are sort of transformed into cargo or turned into, objects of violence or just sort of represented in legal terms. And instead we have this just kind of absence. I mean, and she talks about that too. And so, I think that reading that kind of work has really helped me be more attuned to what is being said and not being said in this collection. But I mean, yes, it's wonderfully powerful work that field is doing.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me move on to the other Heinz. Next question for Sonia. So when you were creating your kit, how did you plan your syllabus, knowing that your students have some of this stuff and you were teaching remotely?
Actually, I think that I can answer Chaim's question by segueing really nicely from Huisang, your last ones, and Rachel's remarks here regarding absences and silences in the archive. So, and I say this in part because I've really been, I'm a new convert to critical archival studies and the work of Michelle Caswell. I've recently started reading that. And in doing a course so to approach Chaim's question, this is a graduate seminar in medieval manuscripts. And so my graduate students, and it's both MA and PhD students from my own department in art history, comp lit, English literature, and I think that, and I have an emeritus librarian as well in the class. And the expectation is that the course will have theory, right? It will not just be skills oriented, which is great. So I organized the class according to theories that they would come across and learn about while researching medieval manuscripts that relate to Hildegard von Bingen. So for example, we had 2 sessions on authorship, theories of authorship and the practice of authorship in the Middle Ages. What does it mean to get to be called an author? How is authorship a discursive category? So on and so forth. And so for each of those sessions, I had my students read subject relevant secondary literature, the primary text, which was Hildegard, theoretical literature, things like Hartman, Vincent Brown's Mapping a Slave Result, when we talked about maps and Hildegard. And for each one of those sessions, I thought about a relevant skill in codicology that they would need to learn that is apt to that subject. The class has been, so they're 3-hour sessions. Putting together that syllabus was like juggling squids. But hopefully it's coming together, and that's the way that I've done it. So I thought thematically and theoretically first, matched it with the skills thereafter.
Oh, that's great. I think the Sonia's answer is closely related to the other question that I'd like to ask for Marissa, because I was really curious about your collaborative work with librarians and curators. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the benefit of having them involved in pedagogy. Especially, I was curious if they could shed some light on blind spots that academics could not recognize.
It's always humbling and enriching to work with experts who have really different expertise than you do. And sometimes my librarian collaborators pointed out things that, for my own embeddedness and my field of literary studies and English literary studies in book history and bibliography, that I couldn't quite see anymore or needed to explain again a second time because my colleagues hadn't gotten it and my students were also looking confused. So Christina Riemann Murphy is such a skilled teacher and an advocate for open pedagogy. And we'd already been working together in just research sessions in my literature classes. And when Heather Froelich joined Penn State, I knew that I had an opportunity to collaborate with someone who had digital humanities skills and training that I do not have. And because we were already working digitally with the manuscript, it seemed like a natural fit to bring her into the project and share her expertise. And the whole project is guided by the Student Collaborators Bill of Rights, which I'll put a link to in the chat, coming from UCLA's DH Center. So each of the students should feel empowered to do what they can and want to with the information they've created, with the knowledge that they've created in the project. But also all three of us as faculty and librarian leads are doing our own research based on the work that we've done together, so that we currently have an active IRB for the project where so Christina is getting publications out of this, Heather's getting presentations and publications out of this. We're all currently doing research, and each of us have our own research goals connected to what the students are doing, and the students are empowered to use their own information too. It would not be possible to do the project the way I'm doing it without active collaboration with these two librarians with two really different specialties.
Okay, that's great. So do you have any suggestions for the novice teachers in approaching the other specialists in library? I mean, practically, and yeah, whatever it may be.
You know, the first step is something I learned from a lot of conversations I had with Ryan Cordell as a member of the SOFCB early on, about making sure your collaborators have something to gain from working with you. So it's not just that they're providing support, but that this also fits into their vision for what they want to be doing and learning and advancing in their own lives and careers. So and I initially piloted this project on my own, and only later, once I developed relationships more with these librarians, thought about where they'd fit in. So I think there were a lot of conversations before beginning a collaboration, and making sure it meets their needs as well as yours, I think are both really important steps. And I think Rachel would probably also have some stuff to say about this, because her project is also so collaborative. So I'm going to toss it to Rachel too.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so this project is, it's collaborative across institutions, across kinds of institutions, and then also with faculty and librarians. But yeah, I mean, I would say, I totally made that mistake early on, that I sort of sent an email to the rare book director and was like, hey, I want to digitize the Ballator collection. She was like, let's back up a few steps. So yeah, I think, just trying to it's it's difficult, and I recognize, of course, that I'm structurally in a very different position than the students, undergraduate and graduate, working on the project. But an important goal is to make sure that this is a research project that's meeting everyone's needs and interests, and not one where I'm sort of treating the students and others who work on the project as my research assistants. Like, that's really not what I'm going for.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And a couple of minutes ago, Chaim asked another question for Yael. So he asked the question about what Yael mentioned about the data. So how much is accrued and how much is added? I was wondering if you could re-elaborate on this point. So could you revisit what you talked about the data?
I don't recall actually putting it quite like that. I mean, I would say that all data is created. All metadata, that is the data about data, is created, right? It's not inherent to an object. We identify it and we name it and we classify it. So I think one of the virtues of organizing one's data set in a tabular format is that you can kind of step away from the hierarchies that are embedded in collection catalogs, because you can move your columns around, you can sort alphabetically, you can sort by size. I taught a course last semester entirely remote because of what we're all dealing with. That was an introduction to digital art history, where we used essentially the collection of South Asian objects at our college museum as our data set. And that was it was shockingly informative, precisely for this reason, because a lot of the work that the students were doing was to analyze the metadata and ask questions about why are these objects identified in the way that they are? Where do these terms come from? So I don't know if that's what the question that the answer you were hoping to get, Chaim, or where your question was going. But again, I think all metadata, nothing is inherent to any object we work on. It is all mediated and human made.
Okay, thank you. And actually, I had a question for you, Yao, and especially it's more related to the familiarity with the language used in the manuscript that we are dealing with. So as a historian of early modern Korea, I'm in the same shoes with you, because most of my students are not familiar with language used in the early modern Korean manuscript. So I was just curious how you kind of orchestrate this kind of non-reading of text along with the study of material text.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say it's a reading of form and structure over reading of text. And so for that very first assignment, where they have to analyze this 19th century Iranian manuscript, which I don't think I've had a single student who could actually read any of the text. They're really pushed into the deep end, and often there's a lot of anxiety about what they're doing. But they are therefore, in a way, it's kind of an advantage that they can't read the content, because they then have to attend that much more closely to the organization of information and text as information and as form. They are able to kind of tune into script and styles of script. They tune into color of ink and the layout of the page. So they can still do all of that absent, right? And they actually, they theorize, they make assumptions about what the text might contain. And oftentimes they're pretty close. And again, that's without being literate in the text at all. Now, one thing I don't do, I don't know if you do this, Huisong, I don't have sort of calligraphy exercises. I feel a little weird about that. I could be persuaded to feel otherwise, partly because the scripts that are used to copy, say, Persian and Urdu today are popularly still used today for handwriting and also in modern fonts. And it feels a little weird or kind of funny to me to introduce them in a course that is historically focused, because these are living calligraphic traditions. But I would be open if anyone has suggestions for other ways to do that. But I don't do those kinds of exercises. Rather, it's through sort of close looking and description, not through the sort of making of letter forms that they can't read.
If I could just jump in really quickly, not about calligraphy, but I will also say as encouragement, I took an undergraduate class, a full semester in paleography before I ever learned a stitch of Latin. None of my students have Latin, and I tell them this and it really puts them at ease. So it's about recognizing characters and forms and shapes, albeit in something that is Roman, that you can transcribe as Roman characters, which is not easier than what you face, Yael.
Okay, thank you all very much. And unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we have to conclude our discussion now. And I would like to thank you all panelists for their wonderful presentations and discussions, and also for audience for their active participation. I hope all of you will enjoy the rest of the day or evening, depending on different time zones from which you joined this panel. Thank you very much.
And on behalf of RBS, I'd just, again, like to thank the panelists, Sonia, Rachel, Marissa, Yael, and Wee Sung for a fascinating conversation. And thank you to all in the audience again for all your great questions and comments. I'd like to note really quickly that we are still accepting applications for a number of summer 2021 courses, and you can find out more on the RBS website. So yes, again, have a nice night, everyone.